"Bring me the seamstress." The Duke's voice cracked through the hall like a whip, and every servant in the room froze where they stood. Nathaniel Ashworth stood at the top of the staircase, holding the ruined gown in both hands, the silk torn clean through the bodice, the pearls scattered across the marble floor like tears. He had exactly 4 hours before Lady Priscilla Vane and half the county arrived for the betrothal dinner his aunt had arranged without his permission, and now the gown meant to dress his cousin for the announcement was in pieces. "The village dressmaker is in bed with fever, Your Grace," said the housekeeper, Mrs. Farrow, wringing her hands. "There is no one else available on such short notice, except who?" His voice dropped low, dangerous. "There is a widow near the eastern cottages. She takes in mending for the staff. She is skilled, Your Grace, but she does not usually work for the house." "I do not care if she usually milks goats for a living. Bring her here, now." Mrs. Farrow did not argue further. She sent a boy running down the frost-covered path toward the cluster of small stone cottages at the edge of the estate, where smoke rose thin and gray from a single chimney. Inside that cottage, Clara Bennet was kneeling by a narrow bed, pressing a damp cloth to her daughter's forehead. Margaret's small chest rose and fell too fast, her lips pale, her eyes half closed. The physician had come the week before, and left behind a bottle of medicine and a bill Clara could not pay. She had been rationing the drops, stretching them thin, praying they would last until she found more work. The knock at the door came hard and fast. "Mrs. Bennet, the Duke requires you at the house immediately." Clara's hand stilled over her daughter's forehead. The Duke had never once sent for her in the 3 years she had lived on his land. She rose, smoothed her plain wool skirt, and opened the door to find a boy out of breath, his face red from running. "He said now, ma'am. He said bring the seamstress." She looked back at Margaret, who stirred weakly and murmured her mother's name. "I cannot leave her," Clara said. "Mrs. Farrow says you must come, or the Duke will send someone to fetch you himself, and it will go worse for you." Clara's jaw tightened. She had no choice. A refusal from a widow with unpaid debts could mean losing the cottage entirely, and then where would Margaret sleep when the fever finally broke, if it broke at all? She called for her elderly neighbor, a woman named Agnes Whitfield, who came at once and settled by Margaret's bed with a promise to watch over her. Clara wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders and walked to the long path up to the great house, her sewing basket swinging at her side, her heart hammering with a fear she refused to let show on her face. When she stepped into the grand hall, she felt every eye turned to her. The maids in their crisp aprons, the footmen standing stiff by the doors, and at the top of the stairs, the Duke himself, tall and severe, his dark coat immaculate, his expression thunderous. He came down the stairs holding the ruined gown out like an accusation. "Can you fix this?" he said. It was not a question. Clara set down her basket and took the gown in her hands. She turned it over, examining the tear along the seam, the missing pearls, the delicate embroidery that had come loose at the collar. Her fingers moved with quiet confidence over the fabric, and for a moment she forgot to be afraid of him. "The tear can be mended so no one will see it," she said. "The pearls will take time to replace properly, but I can stitch new ones in place before the evening if someone brings me a box of matching beads from the sewing room. The embroidery I can repair by hand." "How long?" 3 hours, if I am not interrupted." He studied her then, really studied her, as though seeing her for the first time. She was not what he expected. Her dress was plain, mended in places herself, her hands roughened by work, but there was nothing timid in the way she held herself. She met his eyes without flinching, which surprised him more than anything else that day. "You have 3 hours," he said. "Mrs. Farrow will show you to a room. If the gown is not ready, you will answer to me." "It will be ready," Clara said, and something in her voice made him believe her. She was led to a small sewing room off the east wing, given a box of beads, good thread, and a lamp, and she set to work immediately. Her hands moved fast, practiced, sure. She had learned to sew as a girl from her mother, and later she had sewn for her husband's small shop before he died, and left her with debts she never knew existed. Every stitch she made now was a stitch toward keeping a roof over her daughter's head. The Duke did not leave. He paced the corridor outside the sewing room, unable to settle, his mind circling around numbers and obligations and the guests who would arrive expecting perfection. His aunt found him there and scolded him for hovering like a nervous bridegroom, though the marriage in question was not his own. "You should be dressing, Nathaniel," she said. "Let the woman work. I want to see it is done properly." "You want to see her work," his aunt said, arching an eyebrow, and he turned away without answering. because there was some truth in it he did not wish to examine. 2 hours passed. Then, near the end of the third hour, Clara opened the sewing room door and stepped into the corridor, the gown draped carefully over her arm. The tear was gone. The pearls gleamed, new and matched perfectly to the old. The embroidery along the collar had been restored so precisely that no one would ever know it had been ripped that morning. The Duke took the gown from her hands and turned it over slowly under the lamplight, searching for any flaw. He found none. "You have done this before," he said. "I have done a great many things I never expected to do, Your Grace." There was something in the way she said it, quiet and unadorned, that struck him harder than any flattery could have. He was used to people fawning over him, praising him, agreeing with everything he said. This woman had simply stated a fact and moved on, as though his opinion of her work mattered less than the work itself. "You will be paid for this," he said. "Double what the village dressmaker charges. That is generous, Your Grace. It is fair. You saved my household from embarrassment tonight." She inclined her head and gathered her basket, preparing to leave, eager now to return to her daughter's bedside. But he stopped her with a question he had not planned to ask. "Do you have family in the village?" "A daughter," Clara said, and something flickered across her face, quickly hidden. "She is unwell. I should return to her." "Unwell how?" Clara hesitated, unused to a man of his station asking such things. "A fever. It comes and goes. The physician says it will pass with proper medicine and rest." "Then you should not have been kept here so long," he said, and there was an edge of something almost like guilt in his voice, though he covered it quickly with formality. "Mrs. Farrow will see that a carriage takes you home instead of walking." "That is not necessary, Your Grace." It was not a request. Clara did not argue further. She followed Mrs. Farrow out to where a small carriage waited, and within minutes she was being carried back down the frost-covered path toward her cottage, far faster than she could have walked it. She sat stiffly on the seat, unused to such comfort, watching the great house shrink behind her, wondering why a man so cold and demanding had shown even a flicker of concern for a woman he had never spoken to before that day. When she reached the cottage, she found Margaret sleeping more peacefully than she had in days, the fever slightly lower, Agnes dozing in the chair beside the bed. Clara knelt and pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, relief washing through her so completely that her hands trembled. She did not know, as she sat there in the dim candlelight, that behind her at the great house, the Duke stood at his window staring down the dark path toward the eastern cottages, turning over in his mind the strange sensation of having been truly seen by someone who owed him nothing and expected nothing in return. That night, the betrothal dinner proceeded exactly as planned. The gown was perfect. His cousin shone in the candlelight, admired by every guest, and no one noticed the seams that had nearly torn apart that morning. No one except the Duke, who found himself distracted throughout the entire evening, his eyes drifting again and again toward the window that faced east, toward a small cottage where a widow sat awake beside her sleeping child, mending torn things with her own 2 hands, asking nothing of the world but enough to survive it. Lady Priscilla Vane sat beside him at dinner, resplendent in blue silk, laughing at every remark he barely registered making. She leaned close and whispered something about the excellent quality of the gown, praising the dressmaker who must have made it, assuming it had come from the fine shop in town. He did not correct her. He was not sure why he kept the truth to himself, only that something told him it was not hers to know. By the time the guests departed and the candles burned low, Nathaniel Ashworth found himself standing once more at his window, staring into the darkness where a single light still flickered faintly from the direction of the cottages. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself he was simply a man exhausted from a difficult day, his mind wandering where it should not. But he stood there a long while before he finally turned away and went to bed, and even then, sleep did not come easily, filled as his thoughts were with the quiet, steady voice of a woman who had looked him in the eye without fear and mended what he thought could not be fixed. The days that followed brought no rest for Clara. Margaret's fever eased only to return 2 nights later, worse than before, and the small bottle of medicine ran dry faster than the physician had promised. Clara sat by candlelight each evening, needle moving through fabric for whatever mending work she could find in the village, counting coins that never seemed to reach far enough. It was on the 4th night that a message arrived from the great house. The Duke required a set of curtains altered for the west drawing room, and the housekeeper had recommended her by name this time, not out of desperation but out of genuine praise for her earlier work. Clara accepted without hesitation. Any coin was worth the walk, even in the cold, even with worry gnawing at her chest over the daughter she left sleeping under Agnes Whitfield's watchful eye. She arrived at the house well after the household had settled for the evening, expecting to work alone in the small sewing room as she had before. The fabric was heavy velvet, difficult to manage, and she spread it across the long table, measuring and pinning by the light of a single lamp. The house around her had gone quiet, the servants retired, the halls dim and still. She did not hear him approach until his voice broke the silence behind her. "You work late." Clara startled, nearly dropping her pins, and turned to find the Duke standing in the doorway, his coat removed, his cravat loosened, looking nothing like the severe figure who had barked orders at her days before. He looked tired. Human, somehow, in a way she had not expected. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not hear you. You need not apologize. I could not sleep, and I heard movement down the hall." He stepped further into the room, his eyes falling on the velvet spread across the table. The curtains. "I had forgotten I requested those. Mrs. Farrow said you wished them shortened for the drawing-room windows. I can have them finished within the week. There is no urgency." He moved closer, studying the careful pins she had already placed, the precision of her measurements. "You do this work alone, every night, after tending your daughter all day?" "I do what must be done, Your Grace." He was quiet for a moment, watching her hands resume their work, steady, despite his presence looming over her. Most people in his household grew nervous under his gaze, fumbling their words, eager to please. This woman simply continued, as though his rank meant little compared to the task before her. "How is she?" he asked. "Your daughter." Clara's hands paused briefly over the fabric. She had not expected him to remember, let alone ask again. "The fever comes and goes," she said carefully. "The physician says her lungs are weak. She was born early and has never quite grown as strong as other children her age. And the medicine helps. When I can afford enough of it, yes." She had not meant to say so much, and she pressed her lips together, embarrassed at having revealed her circumstances so plainly to a man who could have her removed from the estate with a single word if he chose. But the Duke did not respond with the cold dismissal she braced for. Instead, he pulled a chair from against the wall and sat, uninvited, watching her work in silence for a long moment. "My wife loved this room," he said finally, his voice quieter now, almost as though speaking to himself. "She used to sit by that window in the mornings, before the light grew too strong, and read until breakfast was called. I have not had the curtains changed since she died, though the fabric has faded terribly on that side." Clara looked up, surprised by the sudden openness in his words. "I did not know, Your Grace. I am sorry for your loss." "It has been 3 years." He said it plainly, without inviting sympathy, though something in his posture suggested the wound had not fully closed despite the time that passed. "Everyone tells me it grows easier. I confess I have not found that to be entirely true." "Grief does not follow a schedule," Clara said softly. "I lost my husband 2 years ago, and there are still mornings I reach for him before I remember he is gone." The Duke's eyes met hers then, something shifting between them, an understanding neither of them had expected to find in a sewing room lit by a single lamp. For the first time since she had arrived at the house days earlier, he did not look at her as a servant performing a task. He looked at her as a person who understood, in the quiet, aching way that only those who have lost something irreplaceable can understand each other. "How did he die?" the Duke asked, and then seemed to catch himself. "Forgive me, that is not my place to ask." "It is no secret in the village," Clara said, setting down her needle. "He fell ill suddenly, a sickness of the chest that no physician could name properly. Within a month he was gone, and I learned only after his funeral that he had borrowed heavily from merchants in town to keep his shop running through a difficult season. I have been paying off what remains of that debt ever since. That seems an unfair burden for you to carry alone." "It is the burden I have," Clara said simply. "There is no use complaining of what cannot be changed. I have Margaret to think of, and complaints do not put food on the table or medicine in a bottle." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that she could not quite read. He rose from the chair, straightening his coat, though he did not immediately leave the room. "You are a remarkable woman, Mrs. Bennet," he said. "I do not say that lightly." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, unused to such words from anyone, let alone a man of his station. "You flatter me, Your Grace. I am simply a widow who sews for coin. I have met a great many people who claim to have suffered, and fewer still who bear it with the quiet dignity you carry. I find myself curious how you manage it." "I do not have the luxury of falling apart," she said. "Margaret needs me too much for that." He nodded slowly, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. Then he cleared his throat, seeming to remember himself, the walls he usually kept so carefully in place rising again around his expression. "I should let you finish your work," he said. "It grows late, and you have a walk ahead of you." "Thank you, Your Grace." He paused at the door, glancing back at her once more. "The curtains need not be finished so quickly. Take whatever time you require. I would rather they be done properly than done fast. As you wish." He left then, his footsteps fading down the corridor, and Clara sat alone in the small sewing room, her heart beating strangely fast, uncertain what to make of the conversation that had just passed between them. She told herself it meant nothing, that a duke speaking kindly to a widow for a quarter hour changed nothing about her circumstances or her place in the world. But she found herself thinking of his words long after she finished her work that night and walked the cold path home beneath a sky full of stars, of the way he had spoken of his late wife with such quiet sorrow, of the way he had listened to her own grief without flinching or turning away. When she reached her cottage, she found Margaret awake, restless, her small hand reaching for her mother's the moment Clara sat beside the bed. "You were gone so long," Margaret murmured. "I know, my love. I am here now. Did the mean Duke make you work all night?" Clara smiled despite herself, smoothing her daughter's hair back from her damp forehead. "He is not as mean as they say." Margaret's eyes drifted closed again, exhaustion pulling her back toward sleep, and Clara sat there a long while, watching her daughter breathe, thinking of the strange evening behind her, of a grieving man who had sat in a sewing room and spoken of his dead wife to a woman he barely knew, and wondering, despite every reason she had not to, what it might mean that he had chosen to speak so openly to her at all. 3 nights later, the curtains were finished, folded neatly and delivered to the house before dawn so she would not have to face him again so soon. Though she could not have said, even to herself, whether she avoided the encounter out of caution or out of something else entirely, something she was not yet ready to name. Word travels fast in a household as large as Ellsworth, and it took less than a week for whispers to begin among the staff. A maid mentioned to another that the Duke had been seen leaving the sewing room late at night. A footman remarked that his master had asked twice after the widow Bennet's health, a thing he had never done for any servant before. By the time the rumors reached Lady Priscilla Vane, they had grown into something far larger than a quiet conversation over velvet curtains. Priscilla had spent the better part of 2 years positioning herself as the natural choice for the Duke's second marriage. She had danced with him at every ball the county offered, had made herself agreeable to his aunt, had learned every detail of his preferences down to the way he took his tea. She had not spent that time and effort only to lose ground to a common seamstress with a dead husband and a sickly child. She found her opportunity on a bright afternoon when the Duke's aunt hosted a small gathering of the neighboring families for tea in the garden. Priscilla arrived early, dressed in pale green silk, and made certain to seat herself beside the Duke's aunt, steering the conversation with practiced ease. "I understand the household has taken quite an interest in the widow from the eastern cottages," Priscilla said, stirring her tea slowly. "Mrs. Bennet, is it? I hear she has been summoned to the house rather often of late." The Duke's aunt, a sharp woman named Beatrice, raised an eyebrow. "She mends what needs mending. Nathaniel has been particular about the quality of the work since the incident with the gown." "Of course," Priscilla said, smiling thinly, "though I confess I find it curious that a man so particular about quality would spend a quarter hour discussing his late wife with a seamstress in an empty sewing room at midnight. Servants do talk, you know, however much we wish they wouldn't." Beatrice's expression sharpened, though she said nothing further on the matter, filing the information away with the careful attention of a woman who missed very little in her own household. Priscilla, satisfied that the seed had been planted, changed the subject smoothly to the upcoming autumn festival, but her mind remained fixed on the widow who had somehow, without title or fortune or any claim to importance, managed to capture a portion of the Duke's attention that Priscilla had spent 2 years failing to secure for herself. That evening, Beatrice found her nephew in his study, poring over estate ledgers by lamplight, and closed the door behind her before speaking. "Nathaniel, I must ask you something, and I expect an honest answer." He looked up, setting down his pen. "You have never needed permission to speak your mind, Aunt. I doubt you require it now. There is talk among the staff, and now among the neighboring families, about your interest in the seamstress from the eastern cottages." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "There is nothing to speak of. She has done excellent work for the household, and I have thanked her for it. That is all. Servants say you sat with her in the sewing room discussing your late wife. Servants say a great many things, most of them exaggerated beyond recognition." Beatrice studied her nephew carefully, the same sharp scrutiny she had used to raise him since he was a boy. "I am not scolding you, Nathaniel. I only wish to protect you. You are a duke. Whatever comfort you find in her company, however innocent, will be twisted into scandal the moment it becomes widely known. Priscilla Vane is already sharpening her claws. Priscilla Vane has no claim over my private conversations. No, but she has ambition, and ambition finds ways to make itself heard." Beatrice softened slightly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I only ask that you be careful, for your sake and for hers. A woman in her position has far more to lose than you do, should the wrong sort of attention fall upon her." The Duke said nothing for a long moment, turning his aunt's words over in his mind. He knew she spoke truthfully, knew the danger that idle gossip could bring to a widow already struggling to keep her small household together. And yet he found himself unwilling to promise he would stay away from the sewing room entirely, unwilling to give up the strange, quiet comfort he had found in speaking honestly with someone who asked nothing of him beyond honesty in return. The following afternoon he rode out toward the eastern cottages under the pretense of inspecting the tenant properties, a task he had neglected for months and could reasonably claim as overdue business. He told himself this was the only reason for the visit, though he knew, even as he dismounted before Clara's small stone cottage, that the excuse was thin at best. Clara opened the door with flour on her hands, having been in the middle of preparing a simple broth and startled at the sight of him standing on her doorstep, entirely out of place among the modest cottages and muddy paths of the eastern estate. "Your Grace, I did not expect, please, forgive the state of things. I did not come to inspect your housekeeping, Mrs. Bennet. I am reviewing the tenant properties this week, and yours fell along my route." It was, they both understood, only partially true. But Clara did not press the matter, stepping aside to let him enter out of the cold. The cottage was small but clean, every surface scrubbed, every worn piece of furniture arranged with careful pride despite its age. A small fire burned low in the hearth, and near it, tucked beneath a thin blanket on a narrow bed, lay a child with pale cheeks and dark curling hair, watching the stranger with wide, curious eyes. "This is Margaret," Clara said, moving to her daughter's side. "My love, this is the Duke of Ellsworth." Margaret struggled to sit up, her small face brightening despite her weakness. "Are you truly a duke? Mama says you were very grumpy about a dress." "Margaret," Clara said, mortified, but the Duke surprised her by laughing, a real laugh, warm and unguarded in a way none of his household had heard from him in years. "I was indeed very grumpy," he admitted, crouching down beside the bed to meet the child's eyes properly. "Your mother saved me from a great deal of embarrassment that day. She is quite skilled." "She is the best seamstress in the whole county," Margaret said proudly, though her voice caught with a small cough that made Clara's hand fly instinctively to her daughter's back. The Duke watched the exchange with an expression Clara could not quite name, something between sorrow and tenderness, and she wondered, not for the first time, whether he was thinking of a child he never had with the wife he had lost. "How long has she been unwell?" he asked quietly, once Margaret had settled back against her pillow, tired from the small exertion of sitting up. "Since birth, in truth. She came early, and her lungs have never been strong. The physician says with proper care and rest she may grow out of the worst of it, but proper care requires medicine we cannot always afford." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving over the small, carefully kept cottage, the thin blanket, the low fire that clearly did not warm the room as well as it should. He said nothing of what he was thinking, only rose and thanked Clara for her hospitality, promising to send someone to check the roof before winter set in properly, as tenant business required. But as he rode back toward the great house that evening, his mind was not on roofs or tenant obligations. It was on the sight of a sick child smiling despite her weakness, and a mother who had built an entire fortress of quiet strength around her, asking help from no one, expecting kindness from no one, and receiving so very little of it in return. He did not visit the cottage again that week, mindful of his aunt's warning and the danger of feeding the rumors already circling the household like hungry birds. But he found himself, more than once, standing at his study window in the evenings, staring east toward the cluster of small stone chimneys, thinking of a widow's steady hands and a child's brave smile, and wondering how a man who had everything could feel, in that moment, that he possessed so very little that truly mattered. Meanwhile, in the village, Lady Priscilla had not been idle. She had begun, carefully and quietly, to ask questions about the late Edwin Bennet and the debts he had left behind, gathering information the way a hunter gathers scent before the chase begins in earnest. She smiled sweetly at every gathering, danced every dance the Duke offered his other guests, and waited, with the patience of a woman who had never once failed to get what she wanted, for the right moment to strike. The knock came just after dawn, hard and impatient, rattling the thin door of Clara's cottage, before she had even finished dressing. She opened it to find a heavy-set merchant named Walter Grimsby standing on her step, a leather ledger tucked under his arm, his expression cold with the particular satisfaction of a man about to collect what he believed owed to him. "Mrs. Bennet, I trust you have not forgotten the matter of your late husband's account." Clara's stomach dropped. She had known this day might come, had dreaded it for 2 years, but she had allowed herself to hope, foolishly perhaps, that the debt had faded from memory the way so many small obligations eventually did. "I have been paying what I can each month, Mr. Grimsby. You know this. You have been paying what amounts to pennies against a debt that has grown with interest for 2 years. I have been patient, Mrs. Bennet, more patient than most men in my position would be, but I have my own obligations to meet, and I cannot extend patience indefinitely. How much do I owe now?" He opened the ledger and showed her a figure that made the blood drain from her face. It was more than she could earn in a year of sewing, more than she had ever possessed at one time in her entire life. "I want the full amount within the fortnight," Grimsby said, "or I shall have no choice but to bring the matter before the magistrate. Debtors who cannot pay often find themselves in far worse circumstances than an unpaid ledger, Mrs. Bennet. I would hate to see it come to that, for your daughter's sake if not your own." The mention of Margaret sent a cold spike of fear through Clara's chest. She had heard stories of debtors taken from their homes, their children left with distant relatives or worse, and the thought of Margaret alone, frightened, without her mother nearby to care for her fragile health, was more than she could bear to imagine. "Please," she said, hating the desperation in her own voice, "give me more time. I will find a way." Grimsby studied her for a long moment, something calculating in his eyes. "There may be another way, if you are amenable. My associate, a merchant named Hugh Sterling, has expressed interest in a private arrangement. He is a widower himself, looking for a wife to manage his household. He has offered to clear the debt entirely in exchange for your hand in marriage." Clara felt sick at the suggestion, at the casual way he offered her future as though it were simply another item to be traded against a ledger. "I do not know Mr. Sterling. I have no wish to marry him." "Wishes are a luxury for those who can afford them, Mrs. Bennet. Consider the offer carefully. I will return in a fortnight for your answer, one way or another." He left without another word, and Clara sank onto the small bench by her hearth, her hands trembling, her mind racing through every possibility, and finding no path forward that did not end in disaster. She could not marry a stranger simply to erase her husband's debts, and yet she could not bear the thought of losing her home, of Margaret being taken from her, of the magistrate's cold judgment falling upon a family that had already suffered so much. She said nothing of the visit to anyone, too ashamed and too frightened to speak the numbers aloud, but Agnes Whitfield, sharp-eyed and observant despite her age, noticed the change in Clara's demeanor over the following days, the way her hands shook slightly as she worked, the way she barely touched her food. "Something has happened," Agnes said one evening, settling into the chair beside the fire. "You have not been yourself, Clara. Tell me." Clara resisted at first, but the weight of the secret proved too heavy to carry alone, and eventually the whole story spilled out. The debt, the deadline, the merchant's terrible offer. Agnes listened in silence, her weathered face growing grim. "You cannot marry a man you have never met simply to settle Edwin's debts," Agnes said firmly. "There must be another way. I have thought of nothing else for 3 days, and I can find none." Word of Clara's troubles traveled further than either woman intended, carried perhaps by a sympathetic neighbor or overheard by a servant passing through the village on estate business, until eventually it reached the ears of Mrs. Farrow at the great house, who mentioned it in passing to the Duke while discussing an entirely unrelated matter of household accounts. "The poor woman," Mrs. Farrow said, shaking her head. "Grimsby has always been a hard man about his debts, but to threaten the magistrate over a widow with a sick child, and to dangle marriage to Sterling as the alternative, it hardly seems Christian." The Duke's pen stilled over his ledger. "How much does she owe?" Mrs. Farrow named the figure, and something in the Duke's expression shifted, hardened with a resolve that had nothing to do with tenant business or estate obligations. He said nothing further to Mrs. Farrow, dismissing her with a few brief words about the matter not concerning the household, but that evening he rode into town himself, without informing his aunt or anyone else of his purpose, and sought out Walter Grimsby's shop before it closed for the night. Grimsby, startled to find a Duke standing in his humble shop, straightened immediately, his manner shifting from the cold satisfaction he had shown Clara to obsequious flattery. "Your Grace, what an honor. How may I be of service? I understand you hold a debt against the estate of Edwin Bennet." Grimsby's expression flickered with surprise, quickly masked. "I do, Your Grace, though I confess, I am uncertain how this concerns you. It concerns me because I intend to settle it in full, tonight, and I expect you to consider the matter closed permanently. No further interest, no further threats of the magistrate, and no more talk of marriage arrangements with your associate Sterling. Is that understood?" Grimsby, sensing an opportunity to please a man of far greater influence than any widow could ever offer him, agreed at once, and the transaction was completed within the hour, the full debt paid from the Duke's own private funds, the ledger marked closed and handed over as proof. He did not tell Clara himself. He was not entirely certain why, only that something in him wished to give without expectation of gratitude, wished for once to do a genuine kindness without the weight of acknowledgement attached to it. He sent the closed ledger to her cottage anonymously, wrapped in plain paper, with no note explaining its origin. Clara opened the parcel 2 days later with trembling hands, and when she saw the ledger marked paid in full, she wept, first with relief so overwhelming it nearly buckled her knees, and then with confusion, because she could think of no one who possessed both the means and the reason to erase a debt of that size on her behalf. It did not take her long to guess the truth. Grimsby, unable to resist boasting of his encounter with a duke, had mentioned the visit to another shopkeeper, who mentioned it to a neighbor, who eventually mentioned it to Agnes when she visited the market, and by the time the story reached Clara properly, there was no doubt remaining as to who had settled her husband's debts. She walked to the great house the following morning, leaving Margaret in Agnes's care, her heart pounding with a mixture of gratitude and something sharper, something closer to indignation, that a man she barely knew had taken it upon himself to interfere in her private affairs, however well-intentioned the interference had been. She found him in his study, and did not wait to be announced properly, brushing past the startled footman who tried to stop her at the door. "Your Grace, I must speak with you." He looked up from his ledgers, unsurprised, as though he had been expecting this confrontation since the moment he sent the parcel. "Mrs. Bennet, please, sit." "I will not sit. I have come to ask why you paid my husband's debt without so much as a word to me beforehand. Because you were about to be forced into a marriage you did not want, or dragged before a magistrate over a debt that was never yours to begin with. I saw a way to prevent both, and I took it. It was not your place to interfere in my affairs." "Perhaps not," he admitted, rising from his desk to face her properly. "But I could not stand by and watch you sold like property to settle a dead man's debts, Mrs. Bennet. Call it interference if you must. I call it doing what was right." Clara's anger wavered, uncertain now how to hold on to indignation in the face of such plain, unguarded honesty. "I cannot repay you. Not a sum like that. I did not do it expecting repayment." "Then why did you do it at all?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Because I could not bear the thought of you suffering, when I had the means to prevent it." "Is that answer enough, or would you prefer I invent something more noble-sounding?" Clara had no response to that, her carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of an honesty she had not expected and did not know how to receive. She left the study soon after, her mind and heart in turmoil, unable to reconcile the cold, demanding Duke who had first summoned her to mend a ruined gown with the man who had quietly, without any expectation of thanks, erased the greatest fear hanging over her small family's future. The autumn festival at Ellsworth was the largest gathering the estate hosted each year, drawing every family of standing from the surrounding county into the great hall, for an evening of music, dancing, and careful social maneuvering disguised as celebration. Lady Priscilla Vane had waited weeks for this night, gathering every scrap of information about Clara Bennet's past, like a woman sharpening a blade in secret, and she intended to use every piece of it before the evening was through. Clara had not been invited, of course. Widowed seamstresses did not attend balls hosted by dukes, whatever quiet conversations might have passed between them in sewing rooms and cottages. But fate, or perhaps simple bad luck, brought her to the great house that same evening regardless, summoned at the last moment by Mrs. Farrow to make an urgent repair to a gown one of the arriving guests had damaged during her journey. Clara arrived through the servants' entrance, as always, and was led to a small antechamber near the great hall to complete the repair quickly before the guest was missed. She worked fast, focused entirely on her needle and thread, unaware that the door to the antechamber stood slightly ajar, allowing fragments of the ballroom's music and conversation to drift through. She did not notice Lady Priscilla approaching until the woman's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the antechamber with deliberate volume. Why? Is that not the widow from the Eastern cottages? I had heard she was rather a favorite of the household these days. Clara looked up to find Priscilla standing in the doorway, flanked by two other ladies of similar standing, their expressions curious and faintly amused, as though they had stumbled upon entertainment rather than a woman simply doing her work. "I am finishing a repair for one of your guests, my lady," Clara said carefully, keeping her voice level despite the sudden tightness in her chest. "Of course, you are quite skilled, I understand. Skilled enough to capture the Duke's private attention, if the servants are to be believed." Priscilla's smile did not reach her eyes. "Tell me, Mrs. Bennet, is it true your late husband left you drowning in debt before he died? I heard the most remarkable story about a merchant threatening to drag you before a magistrate, and about some rather desperate arrangement involving a marriage to settle the accounts." Clara's hands stilled over the fabric, her face draining of color. "I do not see how my private affairs concern you, my lady. They concern everyone, I think, when a common widow begins receiving such extraordinary favors from a duke. Tell me, did you seduce him into paying your debts, or did he offer out of pity for your poor sick child?" I confess I cannot decide which explanation is more pathetic. The words landed like a blow, and Clara felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack under the weight of public humiliation, the two other ladies exchanging knowing glances, whispering behind gloved hands. She had endured poverty, grief, and fear with quiet dignity for years, but she had never before been so deliberately, publicly stripped of every shred of privacy she possessed. "I never asked him for anything," Clara said, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. "I have only ever worked honestly for what little I have." "How touching," Priscilla said coldly. "And yet here you are, at a ball you were never invited to, mending gowns in secret rooms while the man who owns this entire estate settles your dead husband's debts. Do you truly believe anyone in this house sees you as anything more than a passing amusement, Mrs. Bennet, a curiosity to entertain a grieving man before he returns to his proper senses and marries someone of his own station?" By now, the commotion had drawn attention from the edge of the ballroom, several guests turning to see the source of the raised voices, and it was in that moment, with the entire gathering's eyes beginning to fall upon the small antechamber, that the Duke himself appeared in the doorway, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene before him. "Lady Priscilla," he said, his voice cutting through the room with an authority that silenced every whisper instantly, "I believe you have said quite enough." Priscilla turned, momentarily startled, quickly recovering her composure with a practiced smile. "Your Grace, I was merely inquiring after Mrs. Bennet's circumstances. It seemed only fair, given the household's peculiar interest in her welfare." "What you were doing," the Duke said, stepping fully into the room, "was humiliating a woman who has done nothing to deserve your cruelty, in front of an audience gathered specifically to enjoy the spectacle. I will not stand for it in my own house." The room had gone entirely silent now, every guest straining to hear, and Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, her cheeks burning with a shame she had done nothing to earn. She wanted nothing more than to disappear entirely, to slip out through the servants' entrance and never return, but the Duke's next words stopped her where she stood. "Yes, I paid the debt left by Mrs. Bennet's late husband. I did so because a good woman was about to be forced into a marriage she did not want, threatened with the magistrate over money that was never hers to owe. I would do it again without hesitation. If that makes me a fool in the eyes of this gathering, then I accept the title gladly, because I would rather be a fool who helps a struggling widow than a man of standing who watches cruelty unfold and says nothing to stop it." Priscilla's face had gone pale, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling in real time before the very audience she had hoped to impress. "Your Grace, I only meant—" "I know precisely what you meant, Lady Priscilla. You meant to wound a woman who has already suffered more loss than most people in this room could imagine, in order to secure your own position. I find I have very little patience remaining for such games." He turned then to Clara, his expression softening entirely, the fury draining from his face as he looked at her. "Mrs. Bennet, I apologize for the treatment you have received tonight in my household. It was inexcusable." Clara could barely find her voice, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of the room's attention, by the fact that a duke had just defended her honor in front of the very society that had, moments before, treated her as an object of ridicule. "Your Grace, you did not need to." "I did need to," he said firmly. "It was long past time someone did." The ballroom remained hushed as the Duke offered Clara his arm, an act so publicly unprecedented that several guests audibly gasped, and led her from the antechamber past the assembled crowd, past Priscilla's stunned and furious expression, past the whispers that would undoubtedly consume the county's gossip for weeks to come. He did not care. For the first time in 3 years, since the death of his wife had left him hollow and withdrawn from any genuine connection, he found himself acting not out of duty or obligation, but out of something he had thought himself incapable of feeling again. In the days that followed, the consequences of that public defense rippled through the county exactly as his aunt had warned they might. Several families quietly withdrew their invitations to future gatherings, uncertain how to navigate a duke who had so openly defended a common widow over a woman of proper standing. Priscilla Vane, humiliated beyond recovery, left for her family's estate in the north within the week, never to return to Ellsworth society again. But within the household itself, something shifted in an entirely different direction. The servants who had once whispered about the Duke's peculiar interest in the seamstress now spoke of him with something closer to respect, having witnessed firsthand a man willing to sacrifice his own standing to protect someone with far less power than himself. Mrs. Farrow, who had always been fond of Clara, made no secret of her approval, finding small excuses to invite Clara to the house more often than strictly necessary for household business. Clara herself struggled to make sense of what had happened, torn between gratitude for his defense and fear of what it might cost them both. She understood, better than anyone, how quickly public opinion could turn cruel, how easily a duke's momentary kindness could become a widow's lasting scandal. She resolved, in the days following the festival, to keep her distance from the great house as much as her livelihood allowed, uncertain whether protecting her heart or protecting her reputation weighed more heavily on her mind. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans entirely, and within the fortnight, circumstances would arise that made distance between them entirely impossible to maintain. The fever returned on a night thick with rain, and this time it did not come alone. Margaret woke gasping, her small chest heaving with a terrible rattling sound that Clara had never heard before, her lips tinged faintly blue in the candlelight. Clara scooped her daughter into her arms, panic clawing at her throat, and ran barefoot into the storm toward the nearest help she could think of, pounding on Agnes Whitfield's door until the old woman appeared, bleary-eyed and instantly alert at the sight of the child in Clara's arms. "The physician is 2 hours away by the northern road in this weather," Agnes said grimly. "She cannot wait that long, Clara." "Then what do I do?" Agnes's eyes flickered toward the great house, its windows glowing faintly through the rain in the distance. "The estate keeps a physician on retainer for emergencies among the household. Go, now. There is no time to stand here deciding." Clara ran through the storm with Margaret clutched against her chest, her feet slipping on the muddy path, rain soaking through her thin nightdress, fear driving her forward faster than she thought her body capable of moving. She reached the great house and pounded on the servants' entrance until a startled footman opened the door, and within minutes the entire household had been roused, candles lit throughout the halls, Mrs. Farrow rushing to send a rider for the estate physician, while the Duke himself appeared at the top of the stairs, already moving before he had fully registered the scene before him. "What has happened?" "It is Margaret," Clara gasped, her voice breaking entirely now that she had reached safety and could feel the full weight of her terror crashing over her. "She cannot breathe properly. I did not know where else to go." "You did exactly right," the Duke said, already descending the stairs. "Bring her here, by the fire. Mrs. Farrow, send for Dr. Elliot immediately, and do not spare the horses getting there." Clara laid Margaret upon a settee near the drawing-room fire, the child's small body trembling, her breathing shallow and rapid, and Clara knelt beside her, pressing damp cloths to her forehead, murmuring reassurances she was not entirely certain she believed herself. The Duke knelt on the opposite side of the settee, his usual composure entirely abandoned, his hands hovering uselessly, desperate to help but uncertain how. "What can I do?" he asked, and the raw helplessness in his voice was unlike anything Clara had heard from him before. "Talk to her," Clara said. "She likes your voice. It calms her, I think, though I could not say why." The Duke did not hesitate, leaning close to the child's ear, speaking softly of foolish, gentle things, of the horses in the stable and the way the autumn leaves had turned gold along the eastern road, anything to distract her small mind from the fear gripping her chest. Margaret's breathing did not improve immediately, but something in her rigid posture eased slightly, her small hand reaching blindly until it found his and gripped it with surprising strength for a child so weak. The 2 hours until Dr. Elliot arrived felt endless, the storm rattling the windows, the fire crackling low, Clara and the Duke kneeling together beside a child neither of them could save through will alone, bound together in that terrible waiting, by a fear so absolute that all the careful distance they had maintained between them simply ceased to exist. When the physician finally arrived, soaked through from the storm, he worked quickly, listening to Margaret's chest, administering medicine from his bag, adjusting her position to ease the labored breathing. It was nearly an hour before he straightened, wiping rain from his brow, and delivered his assessment with the careful gravity of a man accustomed to delivering difficult news. "The fever has settled into her lungs more seriously than before," he said. "She will need constant care over the coming days, warmth, medicine administered precisely on schedule, and rest without disturbance. I believe she will recover, given proper attention, but I will not pretend the danger has passed entirely." Clara's knees nearly buckled with relief and exhaustion combined, and it was the Duke's steady arm that caught her before she fell, guiding her to sit beside the settee where Margaret now slept fitfully, her breathing easier but still labored. "She will stay here," the Duke said firmly, once the physician had departed with instructions for the following days. "Both of you. The eastern cottage is too far, too cold, and too poorly equipped for the care she requires. I will not have you walking that distance in the middle of the night again, should this happen once more." "Your Grace, I could not possibly. I am not asking, Mrs. Bennet. I am telling you what will happen, and I would appreciate it if, for once, you allowed someone else to help without arguing every point of propriety along the way." Clara, too exhausted to summon further protest, allowed herself to be led to a guest room near the nursery wing. Margaret settled into a proper bed, with clean linens, and a fire kept burning steadily through the night. She did not sleep, choosing instead to sit vigilant beside her daughter's bed, and near dawn, she was not entirely surprised to find the Duke standing quietly in the doorway, watching the two of them with an expression she could not quite name. "You should rest," he said softly. "I can sit with her, if you wish to sleep even an hour." "I could not sleep, even if I tried." He entered the room and settled into the chair on the opposite side of the bed without waiting for permission, and for a long while neither of them spoke, watching Margaret's chest rise and fall with steadier rhythm than it had shown hours earlier. "I have been thinking," the Duke said finally, his voice quiet in the candle-lit room, "about the night my wife died. I sat exactly like this, beside her bed, watching her breathe, believing until the very last moment that she would recover, that the physicians were simply being overly cautious. I told myself that grief, if I refused to acknowledge it fully, could not truly touch me." Clara looked up, surprised by the sudden vulnerability in his words. "You have never spoken of it so plainly before." "I have never wanted to, until now." He met her eyes across the bed, something raw and unguarded in his expression. "Watching Margaret tonight, watching you care for her with such fierce, unwavering love, I understood something I had been refusing to accept for 3 years. My wife's death was not my failure to prevent. It was simply a loss, terrible and unfair, but not a burden I was meant to carry as guilt for the rest of my life." "Grief and guilt are not the same thing," Clara said softly, "though they often wear each other's clothing." "No," he agreed, "they are not. And I think, somewhere along the way, in watching you and speaking with you these past weeks, I have finally begun to understand the difference." Margaret stirred slightly in her sleep, murmuring something incoherent, and both adults instinctively leaned closer, checking her breathing, relaxing only when she settled once more into peaceful rest. In that shared moment of quiet care, something passed between them that neither needed to name aloud, an understanding built not from grand declarations but from long nights of honesty, shared grief, and the simple, steady presence of two people who had each learned, through hardship, exactly what mattered most. Margaret recovered slowly over the following days, her strength returning gradually under the constant care the great house provided, proper heat, proper food, medicine administered exactly as the physician instructed. Clara stayed close throughout, torn between gratitude and the persistent worry that such comfort could not possibly last, that eventually she and Margaret would need to return to the modest cottage and the uncertain life they had always known. It was on the 7th evening, with Margaret finally sleeping soundly and color returned properly to her cheeks, that the Duke found Clara sitting alone in the drawing room, staring into the fire with an expression of quiet contemplation. "You are thinking of leaving," he said, settling into the chair across from her without invitation. "Margaret is well enough to travel back to the cottage soon. I cannot impose on your household indefinitely, Your Grace. And if I told you I did not wish for you to leave at all?" Clara looked up, startled by the directness of his words. "I would say you are a duke, and I am a seamstress with a sickly child and a dead husband's reputation attached to my name. Whatever kindness you have shown us, however grateful I am for it, cannot erase the difference in our stations. I have spent 3 years believing my life ended the day my wife died," the Duke said quietly. "I built walls around myself so carefully, that I forgot what it felt like to simply exist without that weight pressing down on every moment. And then a ruined gown brought a woman into my household who saw me not as a title or an obligation, but as a man grieving something real, and who was honest enough to tell me so without flattery or fear. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. I do not care about the difference in our stations, Mrs. Bennet. I have not cared for some time now, though I have been too much a coward to admit it plainly until tonight. Clara's breath caught, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and disbelief she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Your Grace, what are you saying? I am saying that I love you, he said simply, without ornament or grand speech, exactly as he had spoken to her from the very beginning, plain and unguarded. I love the strength you have shown through years of hardship most people could not survive. I love the way Margaret's face lights up when she sees you, and the way she gripped my hand during the worst of her fever, as though my presence could somehow keep her safe. I love that you have never once asked me for anything beyond fair payment for honest work, even when you had every reason to expect more from a man of my position. Tears gathered in Clara's eyes, unbidden, spilling over before she could stop them. I have spent so long believing that no one would ever see me again. Not truly. Not beyond the widow who mends torn hems and owes debts she cannot pay. I see you, he said, reaching across the small distance between them to take her hand in his. I saw you the very first day, standing in my hall, holding a ruined gown, meeting my eyes without fear despite my temper. I have not stopped seeing you since. She did not pull her hand away. For the first time in years, Clara Bennet allowed herself to imagine a future beyond mere survival, beyond counting coins and rationing medicine and bracing herself each morning against whatever hardship the day might bring. She imagined, instead, a life built not on desperation, but on the quiet, steady partnership of two people who had each learned, through loss, precisely what true worth looked like. I do not need grandeur, she said softly. I only need honesty. If you can promise me that, then I believe I could learn to imagine a future beside you. I promise you honesty, he said, for as long as we both shall live. The proposal, when it finally came properly weeks later, was as simple and unadorned as everything else that had passed between them, spoken not in a grand ballroom before assembled society, but in the small drawing room, where they had first sat together beside a sick child's bed, with Margaret watching happily from her chair by the fire, finally strong enough to sit upright unassisted, clapping her small hands with delight when her mother said yes. The county society that had once whispered and scorned found itself, in time, forced to accept what it could not change, and slowly, the widow no one had ever noticed became a woman, known throughout the region, not for her poverty or her dead husband's debts, but for the quiet dignity that had, in the end, won the heart of a man who had everything except someone willing to see him honestly, and had finally found her standing in his own hall, holding a ruined gown, asking for nothing but the chance to do her work well. Spring arrived at Ellsworth with a warmth the estate had not felt in years, and the great house itself seemed to breathe differently under it, windows thrown open to let in fresh air that had been kept shuttered out during the long, cold seasons of mourning. The wedding had been small by the standards of a duke's household, held in the chapel on the estate rather than the grand cathedral in town, attended by those who had shown genuine kindness through the difficult months before, Mrs. Farrow weeping openly through the entire ceremony, Agnes Whitfield beaming with pride from the front pew, and Margaret, dressed in a small gown her mother had sewn herself, scattering flower petals down the aisle with the particular seriousness only a child could bring to such an important task. Nathaniel had insisted on simplicity, and Clara had been grateful for it, unwilling to begin their life together buried beneath the weight of spectacle. There had been no need to impress a county that had already formed its opinions, and those opinions, in the months following the wedding, shifted more than either of them had expected. The families who once whispered about scandal found themselves, gradually, seeking invitations to the same drawing rooms they had once avoided, eager now to claim familiarity with a household that had proven itself capable of both compassion and quiet strength. Clara did not abandon her needle simply because she had become a duchess. It surprised the household at first, the way she continued to spend her mornings in the sewing room, teaching two young maids the finer points of embroidery and repair, insisting that skilled work deserved respect regardless of who performed it. Nathaniel never once suggested she stop, understanding, perhaps better than anyone, that the steady rhythm of needle and thread had carried her through years no person should have had to endure alone, and that taking it from her now would strip away part of what made her who she was. Margaret flourished under the constant care the estate provided, her fragile lungs strengthening slowly with each passing season, proper food and warmth and rest doing what desperate rationing never could have accomplished on its own. By the time autumn returned, a full year after the night she had first arrived gasping for breath in a storm, she was running through the gardens with a vigor that brought tears to her mother's eyes each time she watched from the drawing room windows. Nathaniel took to fatherhood with a tenderness that surprised even himself, spending long afternoons teaching Margaret to ride the gentlest pony in the estate stables, patiently answering her endless stream of questions about everything from the stars to the proper way to address a visiting earl. He had never expected, after the hollow years following his first wife's death, to feel his household filled with laughter again, and he found himself, more often than not, simply standing in doorways watching his new family with an expression of quiet wonder, as though he still could not quite believe his fortune. Lady Priscilla Vane's fate, meanwhile, unfolded far from Ellsworth, her attempt at a strategic marriage in the north failing to secure the standing she had once enjoyed, her reputation for cruelty following her further than she had anticipated it might. Word occasionally drifted back to the estate of her diminished circumstances, though neither Nathaniel nor Clara spent much time dwelling on it, too consumed with the quiet happiness of their own lives to hold on to old grievances. The village, too, had changed its opinion of the widow it once overlooked entirely. Where Clara had once walked the muddy paths unnoticed, carrying her sewing basket to whatever household required mending that week, she now found herself greeted warmly by name wherever she went. The very people who had never once offered her assistance during her hardest years, now eager to claim some small connection to the woman who had captured a duke's heart through nothing more than honest work and quiet dignity. Clara never forgot those hardest years, though. She kept, tucked away in a small chest at the bottom of her wardrobe, the very needle and thimble she had used the night she first mended the Duke's ruined gown, a reminder of exactly how far she and Margaret had traveled from that cold morning when a boy's frantic knock had summoned her to the great house, uncertain whether she would return home with enough coin to buy medicine, or simply another debt she could not pay. She used a portion of her new position and resources, once she had settled properly into her role as Duchess, to establish a small fund for widows across the estate's tenant lands, ensuring that no woman in her former circumstances would ever again face the impossible choice she had nearly been forced into, a marriage of desperation to settle a debt that was never rightfully hers. Nathaniel supported the initiative fully, understanding that his wife's generosity came not from a place of performative charity, but from the genuine memory of what it felt like to stand at the edge of ruin with nowhere else to turn. 2 years after the wedding, a son was born to them, a boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's steady, watchful eyes, and the household celebrated with a joy that echoed through halls that had once felt so cold and empty under years of quiet grief. Margaret, now fully recovered and thriving, took to her role as elder sister with fierce devotion, insisting on being present for every feeding and every small milestone, already fiercely protective of the brother she had waited so eagerly to meet. On quiet evenings, long after the household had settled and the children slept soundly upstairs, Clara and Nathaniel often found themselves in the same drawing room, where everything between them had truly begun, seated by the same fire where a frightened child had once fought for breath, where a grieving man had once spoken honestly of loss for the first time in years, where a widow, no one had ever noticed, had finally been seen. "Do you ever think of that first day?" Clara asked one such evening, her head resting against his shoulder as the fire crackled low, "when you shouted for someone to bring you the seamstress, never imagining who would actually appear at your door?" "Often," Nathaniel admitted, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I think of how close I came to sending you away that day, irritated by your plainness, blind to everything that truly mattered standing right in front of me." "You were rather grumpy," Clara said, echoing Margaret's long-ago observation with a smile. "I was a man who had forgotten how to hope for anything beyond mere survival," he said quietly. "You taught me otherwise, without ever meaning to, simply by refusing to let hardship break the goodness in you." Clara turned her face up to his, the firelight catching the quiet contentment in her expression, so different from the careworn exhaustion that had once shadowed her features during those difficult years of struggle and fear. "I never imagined, sitting in that cold cottage rationing medicine drop by drop, that I would ever know a life like this one. Safe, warm, seen. You deserved it long before you ever received it," Nathaniel said. "I only regret it took a ruined gown and a moment of temper to finally bring us together." "Perhaps some things happen exactly when they are meant to," Clara said softly. "Not a moment before, and not a moment after." Outside, the autumn wind moved gently through the estate's ancient trees, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and turning leaves, the same wind that had once howled around a small stone cottage on the coldest nights of Clara's hardest years, and now moved instead around a great house filled with warmth, laughter, and the steady, unshakable love of a family built not from convenience or obligation, but from honesty, courage, and the simple, extraordinary act of finally being truly seen. And in the village below, whenever a new widow struggled through hardship unnoticed by those with power to help her, the story was told and retold, softened by time into something close to legend, of the Duke who once shouted in anger for a seamstress, and found instead the woman who would teach him, thread by careful thread, exactly what it meant to be whole again.